Hello, curious people. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Curious People Wanted, our behind-the-scenes video series at the Barnum Museum. If this is your first time seeing an episode, welcome. My name is Adrienne Saint-Pierre, and I'm the curator of the collections at the museum here in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Choosing objects from our collection for these programs is always exciting. There are so many really interesting things to select from. And as you may know, sometimes I share things that are brand new to our collection, other times things that have been here for a very long time, even well over 100 years, dating back to when this museum was the Barnum Institute of Science and History. Today, I'm going to show you a very special piece, one that has been here since 1894. This is called a Mummy BeadNet, and it could be about 4,000 years old. Yes, wow! It is a burial artifact from ancient Egypt that was placed over the chest of a mummified person. Bead nets were among the funerary objects that accompanied an individual in their afterlife. And these tubular beads are varying shades of blue and green and are a type of material called Egyptian faience, which I will explain in a minute. The beads were threaded onto linen thread to form a mesh. And then the diamond-shaped pattern is actually formed by small little disc-like beads at the intersections. They're like little tiny rings, and they pull the threads together. So I'm just going to say up front that in no way is this mounting of the bead net on a piece of painted wood appropriate. It's not. This is not what a museum would do today to preserve a piece like this. So why is it still like this? Well, when it comes to the preservation of historic items, there is a philosophy that it is better to leave something alone, unless it is in imminent danger, until a professional conservator can properly address the situation. Otherwise, you can inadvertently do more harm. And in this case, that could be a lot more harm if we were to try and take this off the wood ourselves. A piece like this needs someone with very specialized expertise, and I'm sure you can guess that conservation of historic artifacts is quite expensive. But a conservator's expertise is essential when deciding how to treat or store a fragile item like this. So although the wood and the staples make me cringe, I have to take the do no harm approach and leave it alone. I also realized that someone years ago thought this was the best way to keep the bead net intact, and it might have been a better decision than simply putting it in a box where it would slide around and then get damaged and fall apart. So the good part here is that it is pretty stable, even if this support material leaves a lot to be desired. Hopefully, in the not too distant future, we will be able to have this professionally conserved. So, where did this bead net come from, and what do we know about it? In 1894, P.T. Barnum's widow was traveling in Egypt, and the American consul gave her an ancient Egyptian coffin and mummy to present to the Bridgeport Scientific Society. That scientific society was located right here in what is now the Barnum Museum. Nancy Barnum had undoubtedly told the consulate of her husband's legacy gift, the Barnum Institute of Science and History, and although we don't know the details of her receiving the gift, it was accepted and sent to Bridgeport. It arrived in August of 1894, and several members of both the Scientific Society and the Bridgeport Medical Society decided to unwrap or unwind the mummified body. That was fairly common practice then, before x-rays. When they opened up the coffin, the bead net is probably what they saw first on top of the wrapped body. All we know is that this was removed at the time of the unwrapping. That is the only information we have about this. And unfortunately, there is no record of the unwrapping other than the little bit that appeared in a newspaper article. So how was the bead net used, and how does this one compare to others? Well, as one of the funerary pieces that would accompany the deceased on their journey to another life, the bead-net was laid over the wrapped body, sort of part jewelry and part garment. Jewelry was very important to the ancient Egyptians, not just as something ornamental, but also because it could transfer spiritual powers to the wearers as amulets. So jewelry was precious for that reason too. Amulets also included small figurines, and these were typically placed within the bandaging, but the more jewelry-like pieces were laid on the wrapped body in proximity to the bead-net or on top of it, almost like a necklace or a brooch would be. Some were even worked into the bead-net. The idea was to give the person protection and powers. This bead-net is rather small. It is just 7 inches wide, 16 inches long. Comparing this to examples of mummy bead-nets in other museums, this is really quite modest in size, as they often cover most of the wrapped body, say from the shoulder area down to almost the ankle area, or even the whole body. The small size of this might indicate that the woman's family could not afford a larger one. I say might because I would leave that to the experts to make that determination. There could have been other reasons. Also, you see this bead-net has a border around it with all the little beads lined up against one another. So that's a lot of beads. And some bead-nets don't have any border like that at all. They're just the same edges all the way out from the middle. So I wouldn't assume that this small one was necessarily a cheaper model. And apparently for a family that could not afford a bead-net for the deceased, a less expensive alternative was to have one painted on the linen bandaging. I mentioned earlier that the beads are a material called faience, actually Egyptian faience, which is different from the pottery you may have heard of called faience. It's different because unlike pottery, these beads are not made of clay. They are made of a mineral, quartz. The technical name for Egyptian faience is sintered quartz, which means the crushed up quartz was heated up to a point where it started to melt, but it did not become liquid. So these beads were made by firing them in a kiln with a glazing liquid to put on and kind of create this glossy surface as well as the color. Now, the faience color does not have to be blue or green or turquoise. The color depends on what is in the glazing. But blues and greens were very desirable colors and very common ones for beads in Egypt. Why? Well, the blue and green shades imitated more precious stones like lapis lazuli and turquoise, which were valuable and scarce. For instance, the gorgeous deep blue lapis lazuli had to come from Afghanistan. And colors were also ascribed meanings. The blues and greens had meanings associated with places where the gods lived and with birth and regeneration. So those colors would be appropriate for the person who would be going on to another life. You may still be wondering what the idea is of a bead-net. It's kind of a cross between ornamentation and a garment. Well, in the 1920s, some entire garments, bead-net dresses, were found. Now, most of these came from tombs. Now, they are very rare. Only about 20 of them are known, but they might have been more common. And one thought is that the bead-nets serve as a kind of representation of that garment. And by the way, just as an aside, think of how the discovery of bead-net dresses influenced women's fashion in Europe and North America in the 1920s. All those beaded flapper dresses, many of them sporting Egyptian-style designs. It was a must-have fashion inspired by the tombs. So if bead-nets are related to bead-net dresses, does that mean only the mummies of women had bead-nets? Apparently not. The mummies of both men and women have been found with bead-nets. And that brings me to our story about the mummy that was unwrapped here in 1894. At the time, it was assumed that this was the mummy of a man, a priest called Pabasa. That's because the hieroglyphs on the coffin gave that information. He was 60 years old and from Luxor in Upper Egypt. Fast forward to 2010, and with the help of experts in medical imaging technology, we learned that the person was a woman and only about 30 to 40 years old. In addition, she had lived 4,000 years ago, about 1,500 years before the coffin was made for the priest Pabasa. So how did she come to inhabit Pabasa's coffin? Well, it was not uncommon in the 1800s for mummified bodies and coffins to be mixed and matched when they were sold by dealers. You know, there was a huge market for mummies in the 19th century. So that is almost certainly what happened in this case. But that also begs the question, did this bead net originally belong to the woman, or did a mummy dealer take it from another source and place it on her? I don't think we'll ever have an answer to that. Another mystery. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed learning about this and other mummy bead nets. To me, it's just amazing that something like this has survived for thousands of years and that we can still relate to something like this. There are so many examples of beaded things that people make and wear today. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope you will return to see more episodes of Curious People Wanted, and stay curious.